Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks very much for joining us today. I'm Cassandra Parkinson from ABC Friends, and along with the Alliance for Journalist Freedom, we're hosting this event. You'll meet Peter Greste, who's sitting down there, but he'll be over there, who's the Executive Director of the Alliance very soon. We acknowledge the Kaurna people, who are the traditional custodians with this land, and of the Adelaide Plains, and we pay respects to their elders, past, present and future. We recognise and respect their cultural heritage, beliefs and relationships with the land, and we acknowledge that they are of continuing importance to the Kaurna people living today. I was walking along Hindley Street last night, quite late last night, after chatting with some of the panellists that you're about to meet, and with that on my mind, I passed by two homeless people rugged up against the chilly night. And then within 50 metres, I came across two policemen in the act of arresting a young man while his companion looked through his phone, perhaps to get assistance, perhaps not, I don't know, of course. I saw these three small pictures of life in one part of Adelaide, and I wondered, is this a typical night on Hindley Street? I had no idea what their stories might be, but what I did know was I wouldn't find out from a social media influencer or an AI bot. And I certainly wouldn't know if their individual stories are part of a broader picture of what life is like in this city. Only a journalist with the time and resources to dig beneath the surface could answer such questions. What is public interest journalism? Why does it matter? And how, in a crowded, noisy media landscape, can we work out what deserves our attention and what doesn't? Our panel today will address these and other questions. But before we get to the panel, it's my very great pleasure to introduce the Minister for Communications, Annika. It's a giant portfolio, and the Minister has been flat out since she was appointed last year, addressing a range of significant and difficult issues. We as ABC Friends welcome the Minister's robust defence of the ABC, of a fearless independence ABC. But you won't be surprised, Minister, to know that we'll be seeking more reforms to strengthen the ABC's independence and additional funding in the lead up to the ABC's first 5-year funding plan. So with those very short comments, thank you very much, Minister, for joining us today, and please everyone make her welcome.
Thank you so much, Cassandra. May I also begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we gather today, the Kaurna people, and recognise those with continuing connection to the lands of the Adelaide Plains. Together, we stand on the shoulders of 1,600 generations of First Nations people, and that is our shared history. Over the past 2 decades, trust in public institutions has come under increasing pressure. Governments, science, medicine and journalism have all felt the effects of that. Paradoxically, this has occurred during an era of unprecedented access to information. Most Australians carry the world's knowledge in their pocket, yet access to more information does not always mean access to better information. At the same time, and because of this, the way Australians consume news has changed dramatically. More people are getting their news through social media and through other digital platforms. Algorithms and online communities increasingly influence what information people see, creates challenges for informed public debate, and at times creates bubbles where people have just their own views reaffirmed. These changes have placed significant pressures on journalism. Revenue models have been disrupted, audiences have fragmented, and trust has been tested, if not eroded, at times. The media landscape has changed dramatically. The number of people reading physical papers is dropping. People are less likely to seek out traditional sources of news. A strong and independent press informs democratic participation. It scrutinises power, serves communities, and ensures Australians have access to reliable information. A healthy democracy depends on that. And that is why the Albanese government is committed to supporting a strong and sustainable news sector. As our world becomes more complex, It has never been more important that local stories are told and that Australians have access to local news, local stories. An under-resourced media sector risks losing the capacity for local reporting, the scrutiny and accountability, and that is something that none of us can afford. So our approach has three parts. One, we are supporting the journalism that Australians rely upon through the Journalism Assistance Fund, part of the broader News Media Assistance Program. We are helping sustain public interest journalism right across the country. We are also continuing our support for the Australian Associated Press and for helping regional, multicultural and First Nations media outlets, ensuring that diverse voices remain part of our news and our national conversation. This support is not conditional on what stories are written, and anything to the contrary is an insult to Australian journalists. Our media sector is strong, it is mature, and I know they do and will continue to hold people to account, including those in government. Two, we are helping news organisations adapt and innovate. Through the News Innovation Fund, we are supporting new business models, new revenue streams and greater organisational capacity so Australian newsrooms can succeed in this changing environment. This $31.5 million investment in a strong and sustainable news sector will see newsrooms across the country receive grants of between $10,000 and $9 million each year. These applications are being assessed now. And three, we're making sure that the rules keep pace with the way that Australians access news today. Most Australians now consume content online, people getting their news directly through social media and search engines. But these large digital platforms benefit from the work of Australian journalists, and the Albanese government believes that it is only fair that some of that value is returned to the organisations that created it in the first place. That is why we are progressing the News Media Bargaining Incentive. The existing News Media Bargaining Code is no longer delivering the outcomes it was designed to achieve. This reform will establish a more sustainable framework for the future. The incentive encourages digital platforms to do commercial deals with Australian news organisations. Those that do receive substantial offsets. If they don't, they will pay a charge, and this money goes directly back to the news media sector. The principle is simple. Platforms should contribute fairly to the journalism from which they benefit. This matters because Australians depend on journalism and on journalists to report the stories that matter, whether that's through the press gallery, through local radio, through multicultural media, or through a small weekly regional newspaper. Local news matters to local communities, and those stories cannot be told without supporting Australian journalists. We need more of them, not fewer. But supporting journalism is only part of the task. We also need to help Australians navigate an increasingly complex information environment. That is why our government is developing Australia's first national literacy media strategy. It's never been more important to engage critically with what we see in the media and online. Last month we announced that Where To Research has been engaged to work with the government to develop that strategy in consultation with academic, industry and community stakeholders. The strategy will help Australians build the skills needed to identify reliable information, engage confidently online and better understand the opportunities and challenges of the digital world. By strengthening media literacy, we can also help create the conditions in which trusted and accountable journalism can thrive. The challenges facing journalism and journalists today are not entirely new. The one constant in journalism, apart from deadlines, is the consistency of change. I have confidence journalists will adapt to what their audiences need and want, but it is not an easy thing to do in an ever-changing world. Every generation has confronted technological change, evolving audience expectations and new business realities. What matters is how we respond. The Albanese government is committed to working with the media sector to strengthen sustainable business models, support quality journalism, and help Australians navigate a rapidly changing information landscape. Good journalism can be uncomfortable, and it actually should be uncomfortable at times for governments, but that is exactly why it matters. A free press does not tell governments what they want to hear. It tells them what they need to hear and what the public needs them to hear. Protecting public interest journalism is not simply about supporting an industry, it is about safeguarding our democracy and keeping Australians informed about what they need to know. With that, with whatever time I have left before I'm due back, I would love to hear from our esteemed panel. Thanks, Cassandra.
Thank you very much, Minister. My name is Peter Greste. I'm a Professor of Journalism at Macquarie University and the Executive Director for the Alliance for Journalist Freedom. And it gives me great pleasure and great honour to chair this panel discussion today. We are short of time, so I'm going to go straight to the introductions. I'm not going to make any further introductory remarks of my own. On stage, I'm joined by two of Australia's most eminent journalists who've probably got enough Walkley Awards to fill a couple of pool rooms between them. Lenore Taylor is the former editor of The Guardian and the Sydney Morning Herald's senior national affairs correspondent and also chief political correspondent. Quentin Dempster, of course, is an author and journalist and was for many years one of the ABC's most recognisable figures, both as a leading investigative reporter and the presenter of On 7:30. And Rod Sims is an economist and public servant, and most significantly for our panel, he was the chair of the ACCC, who helped negotiate the world-leading news media bargaining code, which pushed the tech giants to pay Australian news organisations for their content. So this panel really is underpinned by two key understandings. The first is, as the Minister mentioned in her remarks, is that we need good public journalism. We need good journalism to underpin public debate. We can't have a democracy without it. But the other is that public trust is tanking. The recent digital news report from Canberra University said that most Australians, just over half, are getting their news primarily from social media, but that Australians chronically distrust social media. So let me start with you, Lenore. What's gone wrong? Who's failing here?
I do think there's some quite profound challenges at the moment. I think for a long time, certainly the 10 years that I was editing The Guardian, we were very focused on how we kept the business model going, the news media bargaining code that Rod came up with. I acknowledge all of the measures that the Minister's talking about that the government is doing now. But I feel like along the way, we sort of lost focus on explaining to people what public interest journalism is and why it's important. And when people get their news in that massive feed of information and it's, influencers and commentators and podcasters and ads about how you deal with anxiety and sleep better, or maybe that's just my algorithm, I don't know. You don't know what is news in that. And in fact, the algorithm makes it harder for news because, the algorithm favours things that elicit emotion, and fact-based journalism doesn't always elicit emotion, good or bad. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that whole creator economy and the podcasters and everything else. My concern is that the basis of facts, the basis of new information you would not otherwise know were we not here, the accountability journalism, the FOIs, the investigations, is getting smaller and harder, and the commentary and creator economy that's built on top of it is getting bigger and more profitable, and the lines between them about what is journalism and what is not journalism are getting increasingly blurred. And when you add AI into that, where you search and you get a summary or a chatbot answer that uses journalism but doesn't say what it is or where it came from, and doesn't always, sometimes has a link but not many people click back, I think fundamentally the problem is we've lost, or we are not doing enough to explain to people what public journalism is, why it's important. It's not just what you read in the newspaper, and if you don't know what it is, you don't know whether you trust it.
Okay, there's a whole lot to unpack there. One of the things that the Minister mentioned was the need for legacy news organisations to adapt. You guys, both of you, Quentin and Lenore, from the crusty old legacy media, you've screwed up. You haven't really been able to adapt, have you?
I think
That's an outrageous remark.
No, I think it's kind of true. I think the
is,
traditional media was too slow to move to where readers or viewers were in the way that they wanted to get news. I think that's true. But even if we'd been faster and smarter, the problem of distinguishing what we do from what all the other good and bad things that are happening there would still remain, I think.
Reuters shows that the ABC of 15 Australian media outlets is the most trusted media outlet in Australia. The money that the Marx got out of Wayne Swan were at the Labor Party National Conference after the GFC helped the ABC to start the transition to digital platforms. Now Hugh Marks is the MD, and they can get instantaneous access of the good long-form journalism, both in text, video and audio, podcasting in particular, out to multiple platforms from YouTube to Instagram to X to everything else. There is a transition there, but the point I wanted to make in responding to Lenore is that what you're right, we have failed, but so the forces with social media are so formidable that Trump and Steve Bannon can flood the zone, as they say, with shit, and to be confronted with fact-based journalism, which has to make you think, is swamped.
It is swamped, but it's not only shit. There's also good stuff there. It's just swamped.
You can find it. You can find it.
Quentin, the evidence, the statistics show that most Australians are also getting their news from influencers, not the traditional. And it doesn't matter how good the
Everybody's a
ABC's
journalist
content is.
now, Peter. Anybody can be a journalist. The Substack, you want to create content, you can do it yourself.
But surely we have to define what journalism is. Like, yes, I'm not saying that the traditional media are the only repositories of journalism. That's not true. Journalism is a practice, but it's a practice that requires certain criteria about fairness and accuracy. And, you know, there might be some influencers who do that, and good on them and great. But there's a whole bunch who don't.
Well, Guardian Australia, by the way, was in that Reuters assessment of the most trusted in Australia, which is reassuring. However,
I'll come to you in a moment, Rod. But there is a question, because one of the problems is that when the creator world isn't constrained by the traditional values, the ethics, the practices that have been deeply ingrained in traditional journalism. So how do we create that set of ethics and standards? Rod, I'm going to bring you in here, because when you wrote the News Media Bargaining Code, when you negotiated that, you had to deal with that challenge of working out who actually should be, who those social media companies should be negotiating with. How did that work?
Oh, in that sense, it was quite straightforward, Peter. It was payment for media being produced now. So we got a lot of criticism for why don't you...
But it wasn't just anyone that's creating content.
Oh, no, that's right. Yeah, well, I mean... So the definition was broadly public interest news, and I think that largely turned out right. I mean, there was some criticism from people who weren't part of it.
Journal of record type.
Not necessarily.
No, not yet.
Well, I mean, in talking to journalists, they thought we got it largely right. Now, it doesn't mean there weren't some that missed out that should have got the money, but I think largely it was trying to deal with the journalism that was out there at that time, and that was actually essentially focused on news. So I don't think we found that too difficult, even though, as I say, at the margin, some people who should have got payments probably didn't.
So what Lenore has been talking very much about the sort of the lack of any clear distinction between content creators who are producing stuff that looks like news but simply isn't underpinned by the kinds of values that we recognise as essential to good public interest journalism. Is there a way, from a regulator's point of view, of making that distinction?
Look, I think very hard for government to do that, but if I could just say a couple of things. The decline in trust in media has to be read alongside the decline in trust of a lot of institutions. So it's not just media, and we shouldn't think that it is, otherwise we think that the whole problem is based on media. There's just a general lack of trust. The digital platforms have a formula of engaging by enraging people. I think that has polarised the community, and to some extent you see that in journalism, which is itself fairly polarised, and I think that people sometimes don't want advocates as the media. So I think that's been an issue for the media. But you know, there's no doubt the digital platforms plus now AI it is the largest threat to journalism around. And what we've got to do is make sure there's a way of not only getting funding, but making sure that AI and digital platforms, but mainly in future AI, does recognise where the content's coming from. so that you've got payment and you've got recognition.
I want to come to the question of the influence of AI, of social media content algorithms, to you in a moment, Lenore. But before I do, one of the things that Meta did when you negotiated the News Media Bargaining Code was that they said, screw it, we don't want to be a part of this. Our users aren't that interested in news. We're not going to play. Don't they have a point?
What's their point?
That their users aren't interested in news.
No, that's
really
not right. That is just absolutely not right. It never was right, and it is not right. I mean,
misinformation.
They were in it for 3 years. They did 3-year deals. Google did 5-year deals largely. So they walked once their deals fell away. Google was always the largest payer. Meta have always argued that news doesn't matter to them. Remember, just before the News Media Bargaining Code was getting serious, if you were on Facebook, you got a news feed. As soon as the News Media Bargaining Code started to come out, it's no longer a news feed, it's a feed. Goodness knows what of. If you look at the Canberra University research, most people are getting their news off social media, and the main social media vehicle is Facebook. So it's just not true. And if you look, I've seen recently some analysis that Facebook's audience has declined in Canada as they've taken news off that platform. So I just don't think they are very heavily dependent on news. The problem with Facebook is they don't care what the quality of the news is. They couldn't give a toss about it. So everyone in this room cares, but they don't. So if by not paying for news you actually undermine public interest journalism and the whole quality goes down, Facebook doesn't care as long as they've got what everybody else has got.
Content. Lenore, Rod mentioned earlier the way that the algorithms privilege anger, outrage over serious discussion. How did that influence the way that you edited your newspaper?
Well, I can actually remember before that, when I was still the political editor of The Guardian, and I read this thing about what went viral online, and it said nuanced commentary was like the valley of death. And I thought, shit, that's what I do. Like, I do nuanced commentary. This is bad. And then when, as I said, I mean, you've got to distribute your news that way, but you've got to think about the way that you do it. It's not an entirely bad story. So we had a young woman, Matilda Bosley, who is very successful on TikTok, and she manages to portray very detailed and serious news in an engaging way that people on TikTok love. I think she got 1.5 million views once to a TikTok about Tigray. So young people are interested and they were watching, but it's only certain types of content done in certain ways. And it's very, very hard to, like if you've done a big, complicated investigation, you know, which has been legaled up the wazoo and you've got to be super careful about how you write it, try putting that on 3 Instagram posts. Or, you know, like it's really difficult to translate public interest journalism into that environment, even when it works. And I think even in the last 6 months, it feels to me like that algorithmic feed is speeding up. There are more and more and more commentators, more and more opinions, and I think it's getting harder and harder to distinguish even what journalism is.
Quentin, Lenore has spoken quite a bit about the problem of distinguishing what journalism is from the other stuff that's online. Do you accept that? Do you agree that that's the central challenge?
Infinite scrolling and entertainment capacity of it is it's universal, and the momentum is there, and we don't know where it's going to go. I can only think that it'll get worse as far as disengaging, and then through the disengagement and misinforming and disinforming for all sorts of reasons. Political and social and ideological. How do we fix that? Well, I'm pleased to, after Albo's speech to the conference here about AI, and said we in Australia will regulate AI in particular, which is going to data mine, if allowed, would data mine every piece of content created by everybody, every original content creator in Australia, music, every genre, as well as news, if that's where we're going now. It is the challenge for Australia, particularly after Rod's Media Bargaining Code initiative, which was taken up by some other countries around the world. The next iteration of that, as Annika well said, to try to put a revenue floor under Australian media. Then we've got to work on methods by which the copyright permissions are recompensed. If you give away your copyright permission, you have to be recompensed for it. So it's putting a floor that will allow journalists, public interest journalists, to be employed rather than all the people who are doing it for nothing at the moment.
There's so many things that play into this whole debate. You mentioned the money, and again, we'll come to that in 1 second. I want to ask Rod about that. But before you do you accept that legacy journalists have also got a responsibility to elevate standards? That legacy media is playing to the algorithms?
The individual journalist has a responsibility to fight for his or her story particularly if you're in organisational culture, to say to the editor, this is a good story and I think it ought to go up higher for the pure public interest elements of it, the public impact of it. So you have to fight for your story, as it were, if you're a journalist. But such is the hierarchical nature of it, it's up to the editor or the proprietor to pick where they're going to place it. But yes, the individual journalist has always had that responsibility to fight hard to get a good placement for your material.
Lenore?
But in terms of what you commission and how you keep an eye on the revenue model, there is always an incentive to commission things that you know will go well on social media, which you have to sort of withstand if you want to maintain quality. Now, historically, there are media companies that have just sort of followed the clicks, and then, the platform changes the algorithm and they go directly down the toilet. So it's not a smart thing to do in the long term. I think traditional media, I wouldn't defend by any means everything that traditional media has done. I think they've made a lot of mistakes. But I also think that there is a sort of business model for some of the new creators online to bag mainstream media because they monetize themselves as the alternative. Sometimes they're quite good alternatives, but, when people see that or read that, it builds the impression that traditional media is all terrible, all awful. I'm not defending everything traditional media has ever done, but I would contend that the vast bulk of the public interest journalism done in Australia, for now, is still done by traditional mastheads. That might change, but right now that's where it's happening.
One of the things I remember from a university vice-chancellor said to me once was that if you show me the incentives, I'll show you the behaviour. If we accept that it's the incentives that social media have created that are driving not necessarily bad behaviour, but not great journalism, that are privileging the kind of journalism that isn't helpful to our democracy. Rod, is it possible to change the incentives? Is it possible to change the way that the algorithms operate in a way that does support good public interest journalism?
I think it's very hard for government to do that.
Xi Jinping can do it.
Many advantages of different political systems. I think one thing to keep in mind, the data is quite clear that the public trusts, even when they're online, that they trust the media sources more than they do the chatbots. So they're enormously distrustful of what they just pick up online, and I think that's really helpful. So there is really an opportunity there for the media, but it has to stand up and differentiate itself, and in terms of follow the money means maintaining your integrity, because that's the differentiator out there. So it absolutely can be done. And as I say, it's really pleasing to me that the lowest trust is in just the social media stuff that's not done by news media companies. But the key thing we've got to do, Peter, is get payment for media when AI is using it. I mean, it is just outrageous that AI should suggest copyright gets waived. I mean, they want to legalise the theft that's going on. And really, let's just be clear. They've been thieving the content forever. I mean, they set up a platform and they just steal it. I mean, it's just outrageous. So we've got to call it for what it is. And I was delighted that PM used that term about a week ago, that it was theft. So let's just keep that running. This is theft. Now, if you want to legalise the theft, we'll make sure you get paid for it. But you want to do two things. You want to get paid for it and you want to get recognition. It's very important for media to have the recognition as well as the payment. I actually can't see any other... I'm not saying I'm saying it's a necessary condition for public interest journalism.
So as we start talking about payment going to journalism, and I think the phrase journalism is more important than journalist, because as we've seen, as we've discussed, there are all sorts of content creators that are doing journalism in unconventional ways, which brings me back to the point that Lenore raised at the very beginning about how we make that distinction between legacy or good journalism, content that's produced in a way that is fact-checked, that is independent, that is rigorous, that comes with all of the things that we understand as classic journalism behaviours. How do we do that? And I'm sort of prodding you in the direction of the conversations that we've been having last night. I've got an interest in this.
I mean, it's difficult, but there are elements that I think make up journalism. One is that you are always factual and accurate, that you have a mechanism to correct yourself if you've made a mistake, which everybody at some point or other does.
And which AI doesn't.
That you have a commitment to be transparent about the methods of your fact finding, and also transparent about your funding, which I think is really important in that influence on monetising economy, that if people want to be journalists in that economy, and they might well be, and they're probably very good at it, knowing where and how they're being paid and who's paying for them is really important. I think if you pull all those things together, you could create a definition of what journalism is that can move from traditional media sources to new media sources to whomever, because journalism is a practice, it's a process. It doesn't have to be done by the traditional mastheads where it's been traditionally done, but it does have a set of criteria, I think.
Journalism's not like an electrician certificate that you get through trade training or because of public safety. An electrician has to have a peer-reviewed standards to get a certificate. You don't need a certificate to be a journalist, although a lot of people have got journalism degrees and even law degrees and economics degrees now, right through journalism, which helps them in the detail of the work that they do. There's nothing required in the industry. So, as I said, anybody can be a journalist.
You don't want anything required because a requirement would then have freedom of speech issues. But I mean, again, I'll be up front here for this audience. As the Alliance for Journalist Freedom, what we're talking about is a professional association that takes the ideas that Lenore's been talking about in terms of a clear definition of what journalism is, and admits anybody that is prepared to apply those ethics
voluntarily,
and voluntarily, exactly. And that way we can send a signal to audiences about what journalism actually is.
You can put it to the test. I know, Peter, it's a very altruistic aim to lift standards. The Media Alliance, of which I've been a lifelong member, has had responsible for the Code of Ethics, which started after the Second World War. It was contested all up to the High Court twice by agents of newspaper proprietors, and survived the High Court challenge. The Code of Ethics has helped, one of the first in the world, has helped to inform ethical standards. There's freedom of association, so not everybody's a member and bound by those ethical responsibilities. By all means, test it and start your idea of we voluntarily allow ourselves to be held to these standards of the Alliance for Journalist Freedom. And
it's not our standards, but anyway.
Well, you'll set the standards. Yeah. You'll say this is by which your work will be judged if you want to give them the stamp of approval, and see how you go. Many people, including Substack journalists or people calling themselves journalists, may well sign up. It's worthwhile to have an experiment in that idea, so that you do get like a big tick made in Australia.
But I think idea goes to what I see as the biggest problem, which is how you differentiate journalism in order to build trust in it, because if people don't know what it is, they can't trust it. And, you know, those short-term sugar hits of sort of clicks and algorithms can be counterbalanced if you get a steady, trusted stream of information and you know where it's coming from.
We're going to go to audience questions now. We've got only a few more minutes left. There's someone at the back with your hand up. Sir?
Thanks, Peter. Rod talked about one kind of theft, IP theft. I want to ask about a more pragmatic theft, and that is the theft of journalists by governments. I'm wondering if the panel can talk a little bit about what's happening around the country, particularly in this state, where the biggest employer of journalists is the government of the day. And I think it's having a significant impact on the quality of investigative and public interest journalism.
But they're PR operators, aren't they?
They
All
are, and some of the best journalists in this city are now working for government.
Mellon hire them, does he?
He does in large numbers, in very large numbers, and I'm sure it's not the only city in the country where that's happening.
But isn't that the flip side of, if the media is declining and journalists don't have jobs, they're the jobs they take? Like, if you had a vibrant media section industry with more jobs, then people could stay in the industry. It's sort of not the government's fault, it's the business model of journalism that's the problem,
Well,
isn't it?
maybe that's the case, but I'm just asking you to comment on what that impact is on public interest journalism, because I think it's affecting the quality of the journalism we're getting.
It's declining work opportunities in mainstream or legacy media or even new media. Michael West Media, The Conversation, others that have started up, The New Daily out of Melbourne. There's declining work. Rod Sims got going with the media bargaining code because the disruption decimated employment in journalism, particularly in regional Australia. Well, it has a deleterious impact.
Well, look, it can, just a slightly different view. I mean, obviously they're taking the cream of journalism away. That's a problem in itself. But I mean, as one who's worked in organisations that employed people from the media sector to help us engage with the media sector, it does have an advantage as well, having really good people who know the media sector and know how to help you engage with it. So there's a plus there as well.
Lady.
Thank you. Melissa Park, former member for Fremantle and the Executive Director of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. I just want to say how important it is, this issue about establishing what is truth. Last year, during the confrontations between India and Pakistan, there was a serious escalation towards a potential nuclear war because of AI-generated deepfakes and mass disinformation campaign. And so I think what you're doing here is incredibly important, and maybe if you could talk to this issue about these disinformation campaigns. Thank you.
Rob?
Oh, look, I think disinformation, misinformation are just massive issues in our society. I was greatly in favour of having a misinformation, disinformation code, but in the end that just got too hard because people had so many different views about what is misinformation and what is disinformation. So I think I'm now convinced that's sort of too hard. But I think we've got to start putting rules around digital platforms and particularly AI. There's got to be more, where did the story come from? How do you verify it? What's your responsibility if you're doing something wrong? I mean, the idea that, one of the lovely things about the platform, we have this case at the ACCC, a minor variation here, but Uber was telling us not only weren't they responsible for the Uber Eats, the food, they weren't actually responsible for the transport, they weren't responsible for anything. And so it's the same so they're building a business model that's making a fortune and they're not responsible for anything. That can't work. We have to make them responsible for what they're doing. We have to get more transparency about where their information's coming from. So if they're promoting deep fakes, then they have they should face financial penalties. Now, precisely how you do that is an issue, but we just can't let them keep doing what they're doing.
But it doesn't even have to be deep fakes. I mean, now there's this entire clipping or buzzing economy where people are on a sort of Airtasker type app getting paid per view to just flood Instagram and flood Facebook with, they're not fake, but they're not genuine, you know, Facebook posts or whatever, which just floods the zone even more. And it's not disinformation per se, but it just makes the whole thing far more difficult.
My point is there's got to be some rules around this.
And
we just can't let this run the way it is.
And that also makes a very strong signal of what actually is journalism, and it allows the social media companies to elevate that content in a way that the public can identify, even more important. Yes, well, the last question.
That raises a point that I wanted to ask. My name's Michaela Stafracci. When it comes to fact-checking and when it comes to understanding the consequence of lazy journalism that doesn't fact-check, particularly on people's reputations and livelihoods, I think what you've just said, Rod, about introducing some form of mechanism. Now, the Prime Minister spoke yesterday about a fair work court for those employers that don't pay a fair wage and other concerns. Should there be something like that for journalists that fail to fact-check and yet still publish? I'm just wondering.
You're talking about legislative regulation. Broadcast is regulated. Print is not, which is now text, is not regulated.
Well, there's the Press Council and there's the independent...
It's not statutory
But it's not a statutory regulation. But you can take a complaint to the Press Council or for the Guardian, you can take it through to our Ombudsman. There are complaints mechanisms with greater or lesser penalties.
But that's also why...
And you can also get sued.
I think
defamation's a big...
There are some penalties. There's none in the AI work.
But this is also where I think it's really important for the industry to have a much more robust system of self-regulation, both a clear identification of what the ethics and standards and boundaries should be, as well as a clear and transparent mechanism for holding those people that are committed to those standards to account in a way that really helps elevate and improve public trust. Calling it a court, I think, becomes dangerous because you then end up with all sorts of potential problems around freedom of speech and freedom of expression, and particularly because anyone can produce journalism or stuff that they say is like journalism, and that's why we're saying that some kind of central core of information and a professional association that identifies people that uphold those standards is perhaps a really important initiative that we should be considering working on. Right. Ladies and gentlemen, I think that's it. Please join me to thank Lenore Taylor, Quentin Dempster and Rod Sims.
And thanks also to people who assisted us today, especially the McKinnon Foundation, to Sheridan and Peter from the Alliance for Journalists, to Peter Vanderleer and Sue Pinnock from the ABC Friends. Thanks everyone, and thank you, audience, for coming along.
Yeah.